sponsored by the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and the Division of Human Studies. The Russell Lecture is named in honor of Willis Russell, a former historian at Alfred University who taught here for decades until his retirement in 1964. This year, we're lucky to have Professor William Irvin deliver the Russell Lecture. Bill is Professor Emeritus of the History Department at York University, Toronto. His books and articles have covered an impressive range of topics across 19th and 20th century French history. What threads these works together is a career-spanning concern with the rise of fascism in France, and along with it, the failures of key political organizations and institutions in limiting fascism's rise. Bill's latest book, which you can actually find back up there in the corner, is Between Justice and Politics, the Ligue des Droits de l'Homme, 1898-1945. The history of the League of the Rights of Man examines, among other things, the hypocrisy of how activists dedicated to human rights in France could abandon these principles out of political expediency, while some even drifted towards Nazi collaboration. Now, despite his self-effacing nature, Bill has been a very influential scholar on my generation of historians. Of the many things that impress me with his scholarship is that his writing is amazingly clear, engaging, and to the point. So too are his lectures. But rather than you take my word on that, I'll instead turn over the dais to Bill and let him begin his 2013 Russell Lecture titled, Looking for Fascism in All the Wrong Places. Let's give a warm Alfred welcome to Professor William Irvin.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that generous, indeed over-generous introduction. How's the sound level? It's good? All right. I'm very glad to be here for a couple of reasons. One, the most obvious, is it gives me a chance to see my old friend Chris Churchill. Another is that for about slightly more than 3 decades, I have wanted to visit Alfred University, and this is so because in 1980, at a meeting of the American Historical Association, I met Stuart Campbell, who taught history here for almost all his career. We became fast friends, and for the next quarter century, until his retirement, we roomed together annually at meetings of the Society for French Historical Studies or the Western Society for French History. Now, those of you who remember Stuart will recall that he did not suffer fools gladly and was given to making all kinds of acerbic judgments about almost all persons, places, and things. But Alfred was very much an exception, because when he spoke of it, as he did at length, it was always in reverential language. Alas, the periodic plans for us to get together here never quite materialized, so here I am, alas, Stuart is not. Now, Christopher has asked me to talk about the subject of French fascism. And it's an obvious choice, given that one way or another I've been dealing with that question throughout my academic career. But, I really did not start out to look at French fascism. Indeed, on several occasions in my career, I made a deliberate decision to work on areas where fascism would simply not be a consideration. But fascism is something of a tar baby, and no matter where I went, it seemed to stick to me. Whence the somewhat odd title of this talk. Now, one of the reasons why I did not start out to address the issue of French fascism is because fascism has always been a problematic concept. What is fascism and what is not? And historians have always done a terrible job at coming up with a universally agreed upon definition of fascism. Oh, and for the benefit of the political sciences out there, I don't think you've done much better, okay? The trick has always been to find a definition of fascism that is not so broad as to include everyone to the right of whomever is the current repository of revolutionary virtue, and not so narrow as to include only Hitler and his gang, with Mussolini's outfit getting honorable measure by virtue of an unfortunate choice of name. Okay? Actually, this can get seriously crazy, because there are those who want to exclude the Nazis from the fascist chapel, either because having the Nazis in gives fascism a bad name, or because including them tends to do violence to certain cherished conceptions of what fascism is all about. Now, there's all kinds of one-sentence definitions of fascism out there, all right. The German historian Ernst Nolte gets high marks for being succinct when he said fascism is violent resistance to transcendence, although I never found that terribly useful when considering whether or not Franco's Spain was somehow fascist. Roger Griffin tried to help us out by informing us that fascism is palingenetic. Although even after I found a dictionary which actually contained that word, I wasn't much further ahead. And philosophic illiterate that I am, I was simply left scratching my head when Martin Kitchen helpfully assured us that the relationship between fascism on the one hand and traditional conservatism on the other was best grasped by the Hegelian concept of the non-identical identity. Right? And this problem is particularly acute for French historians. I mean, students of Italian or German fascism may feud like cats and dogs about what fascism is all about, but at least they're reasonably certain they're dealing with fascism. But in France, no one of much significance ever called themselves a fascist or even admitted to being fascist. So anyone who dares to call this, that, or the other movement fascist runs into an intractable problem of definitional anarchy. So I did not start out looking at fascism at all. What I wanted to study instead was the traditional French conservative right. In particular, it was a political party in France in the interwar years called the Republican Federation. They were the classic representatives of the traditional conservative right. The party was archly nationalistic. The president of the party, Louis Marin, for example, voted against the Treaty of Versailles on the grounds that it was too soft on the Germans. Right? Give you some indication of how that worked. It was a traditionally Catholic party. It was socially conservative to the point where it was not very adept at distinguishing progressive social legislation from red revolution. But it was a parliamentary party and a Republican party. Indeed, the party was universally referred to as les modérés, the moderates. And this was a reference to conservative Republicans in the previous century who had insisted that they were Republican moderates, but in no way moderately Republican. So this isn't the kind of terrain where you expect to encounter a lot of fascists, right? The words moderate and fascist tend not to get used in the same sentence. And this was the more so because the dominant historiography of the period, represented by the most distinguished of students of the French right, René Raymond, insisted that there was a huge gulf separating the radical, the traditional French right from fascism. His highly influential book, La Bonne en France, published over 60 years ago, but repeated in many other editions, clearly argued that fascism was extra-parliamentary, anti-parliamentary, very often paramilitary, populist, and given to demagogic rhetoric, which was often closer to that of the revolutionary left than anything a conservative might accept. Moreover, he argued that apart from a couple of pathetically small little groups, French fascism never amounted to very much, and that France, in the interwar years, was more or less allergic to and immune from the fascist temptation. Now, it is true that some years later, the immunity thesis was challenged by the Israeli historian Zev Sternhell in a book called Ni droite ni gauche, neither right nor left. And Sternhell did not share Raymond's Catholic conservatism and was very much a social democrat. And he insisted that Pache Raymond, fascism was as French as state-free, and that there were fascists all over the place in the interwar years. In fact, according to him, the origins of fascist doctrine can be traced back to France in the late 19th century, where there developed, in his theory, an amalgam of non-Marxist socialism on the one hand and nationalism on the other. But what got lost in the Sternhell-Raymond feud was that the two agreed on at least one thing, that fascism has nothing to do with conservatism. I mean, Sternhell says, direct quote, "It is precisely that long struggle between the right and fascism, all rights and all fascisms, that constitutes one of the most striking chapters in French politics." So that's putting it on the line. So no matter where one stood in the Raymond-Sternhell debate, which incidentally is still going on 40 years later, the one thing both agreed upon was that a certain young graduate student starting out to work on the Republican Federation did not have to worry his pretty little head about fascism. Only thing, I hadn't got all that far into my research before I came across movements in France that struck me as being, well, kind of fascist. They were extra-parliamentary, they were anti-parliamentary, they were at times paramilitary, they were populist, and given to radical demagogic rhetoric, often much closer to the revolutionary left than anything a modéré would be comfortable with, right? And those were pretty much the fascist traits identified by Raymond. And here I'm talking about right-wing leagues which flourished in the interwar years, leagues like the Jeunesse Patriote, that's loosely the Young Patriots, or the Croix de Feu, the Cross of Fire. It's a reference to there being a veterans organization. Okay, so the problem was that notwithstanding the impeccable logic of both Raymond and Sternhell, these guys were, contrary to what the theory would predict, thick as thieves with the Republican Federation. So by way of example, Pierre Tétinger, who was the president of the Jeunesse Patriote, was a vice president of the Republican Federation. His second in command in the Jeunesse Patriote, Edouard Soulier, was also a vice president of the Republican Federation. And no fewer than 47 deputies, deputies here is a member of Parliament, I'm in the States now, representatives, okay, in Parliament, 47, a clear majority of its parliamentary caucus, belonged to the Croix de Feu. And yeah, there was periodic tensions between the leagues and the Fédération, but most of the time they seemed to be acting in concert. So, what explained this mésalliance, which did violence to the cherished theses of both Raymond and Sternhell? Well, in time I realized that the explanation was tied up in the weaknesses of parties of the traditional right. They were, to pay obeisance here to my political science colleagues, they were weakly articulated parties, much like their counterparts in Germany and Italy. Unlike the mass parties of the left, they had fewer militant, active members. They had rudimentary or non-existent constituency organizations, and rarely any of the parallel use or women's movements, which are characteristic of the parties of the left. You know, the Federation was an elite party. You know, it had leaders, but it didn't have any troops. It relied on deference politics and the influence of local notables for electoral success. And it's true, this had worked reasonably well in certain parts of France, where, you know, there were electoral fiefdoms, and where the population could be counted on to follow the dictates of the local gros bonnets, the local big shots. But the trouble was, in a modernizing France, there were fewer and fewer such safe constituencies. And the clout of local notables was increasingly undercut by the rigorous electoral machines of the parties of the left, especially so in the 1930s, which saw the exponential growth of the Socialist Party, of the Communist Party, a dramatic increase in their electoral representation, and a fivefold increase in the left-wing trade unions associated with them. And every once in a while somebody on the right said, well, we should match the left when it comes to party organization, but they were never any good at this. They didn't much care for having a mass party with assorted militant, energetic members telling them what they should do once they got into Parliament. They weren't good at the baby-kissing stuff, and so the various dilatory attempts at creating modern and efficient parties invariably foundered. Now, faced with this dilemma, these right-wing leagues were obvious allies. They did have troops. By way of example, in 1937, the Croix de Feu, or its post-1936 reincarnation, could claim 2 million members. That's almost certainly an exaggeration, but the figure 700,000 probably isn't. Now, contrast that with the Republican Federation, which had 11,000 members, if by members you meant the people who bothered to subscribe to their weekly house organ. So, what the Federation had in mind was for these masses of people with things like the Croix de Feu to work as useful electoral auxiliaries, and if need be, useful shock troops who could parry an attempted insurrection from the left. And it struck me that there was a pattern here that goes beyond France. You know, beleaguered elites turning to somewhat rough and tumble but very muscular allies in an attempt to fend off revolution, or often coming to the same thing in their mind, radical reform. I thought I detected that pattern in the Italian case, and albeit not quite so clearly in the German one as well. So I thought this has got to be the central dynamic of what fascism is all about. And it became the framework of a book that was ultimately published called French Conservatism in Crisis. Now, I'd love to be able to assure you that that book made a big splash, but alas, it was the kind of book that most reviewers described as useful. And for the benefit of future graduate students out here, should you write a book described as useful, do know that this is just a notch better than being told that you have filled a much needed gap in the literature. Right? It got worse. Some reviewers, mean-spirited ones anyway, said, well, okay, Irvin has clearly demonstrated that the close links between the Jeunesse Patriote and the Croix de Feu and the Federation. But this doesn't prove anything, or more accurately, all it proves, contrary to what he appears to think, is that those guys, Jeunesse Patriote, Croix de Feu, were, at the end of the day, conservatives, and not fascist at all. This has always frustrated me, because I don't recall anybody ever arguing that when Italian conservatives, whatever labels they might have chosen, like Orlando and Salandra, headed up the fascist Listone in 1924, that somehow made Mussolini's guys non-fascist. Well, okay, my initial foray into fascism, not having been exactly a resounding success, I resolved to get out of there altogether. I wanted to go back to the 19th century, where fascism wasn't going to be an issue. I was still interested in the right and wanted to look at the royalist right, who in some respects were the ancestors of the Republican Federation. Now, my royalists were what the French call Orleanists. These were people who were great believers in parliamentary politics. They wanted to give royalism a modern 19th century facelift. They didn't want to restore the pre-1789 old regime. What they really wanted to do was convert France, then a republic, into a constitutional monarchy somewhere between the British model and the German model. They were a potent force in French politics as late as the mid-1880s, but a decade later were more or less finished. And the demise of royalism is something I wanted to look at because, among other things, it more or less coincided with something called the Boulanger Affair. Okay, what was the Boulanger Affair? It involved a renegade general, Georges Boulanger, who in the 1880s proclaimed himself to be an advanced Republican, at a time when there were damn few Republicans of any kind, advanced or otherwise, in the officer corps. He was young, he was good looking, he was very adept at self-promotion, and he became Minister of War in several Republican governments in the late 1880s. In that capacity, he did everything possible to please the Republican left and to seriously beak off the royalists. He kicked the royal princes out of the army. He imposed military service on seminarians. He made much of his overt sympathy with the working classes. Above all, he posed as le général revanche, the revenge general, who had regained the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, lost in the 1870-71 war with Prussia. Incidentally, all of this was calculated to outrage the royalists. The last point in particular, because royalists were convinced that war would lead to revolution, as it had at the time of the Paris Commune. Now, as it turns out, this concern about his bellicosity was also shared by moderate Republicans who bounced him out of his job in 1887. But by this time, Boulanger was just about the most popular guy in France and had picked up a substantial following, the so-called Boulangistes, who were drawn almost exclusively from the ranks of radical Republicans and socialists. So Boulanger, in response, because he wasn't happy with losing his job, began to mount what was effectively a plebiscitarian campaign. He would run in one by-election after another. Once elected, often by huge majorities, he would resign his seat and run elsewhere. By the beginning of 1889, he had won in Paris and seemed to be an unstoppable force. So much that the Republicans, who were really tough guys, actually, decided on perfectly dubious and probably illegal grounds to kick him out of France. Nonetheless, his followers ran a massive, albeit ultimately unsuccessful, campaign in the general elections of 1889. Now, the critical point here is that the predominant historiography had always seen Boulangism as essentially a left-wing phenomenon. Right? Indeed, the aforementioned Zev Sternhell had pounced on this amalgamation, as he saw it, of socialism and nationalism as being the essence of and the beginnings of fascism. To be sure, everybody kind of obliquely acknowledged that, well, yes, in 1888 there had been some secret conversations between the Royalists and the Boulanger, and that, yes, in due course, a fair bit of money changed hands. But all historians agreed that this was, in the end, quintessentially unimportant. A minor sidebar, the machinations of a nest of desperate Royalists, probably duped by the avaricious Boulanger, and an episode that was no importance to understanding Boulangism. I also, of course, have a ingrained skepticism about received wisdom, especially when nobody can show me a serious scholarly book on the subject which proves it. So after a couple of years of burying myself in the copious archival sources on Royalists, was able to show that after February 1888, Boulanger was entirely controlled by the Royalists. All those electoral victories occurred in Royalist regions. The great majority of the folks who voted for General Boulanger were Royalists, and they did so because the Royalists, who incidentally were also paying for his campaigns, told them to do so. Yes, many of Boulanger's followers may have been a bunch of lefties, but they were avaricious lefties, and they did what they were told by the Royalists, especially, incidentally, in the 1889 election. So, we have yet another mésalliance. Now, the question is, well, why would two groups who had every good reason for hating one another's guts so merrily hop into bed together? Well, one explanation might have been that Boulanger had assured the Royalist leadership in February of 1888 that if he got into power, he would restore the monarchy. But that can't suffice. Boulanger was almost certainly the most accomplished liar of the 19th century, and the Royalist leadership wasn't stupid. A far more compelling explanation is analogous to the one I used to explain the promiscuities of the modérés of the 1930s, to wit, the organizational weakness of the Royalists. Much like the Federation 50 years later, they relied on deference politics and eschewed the kind of more modern political organization that their Republican opponents were starting to adopt. But France was changing, and what had worked a decade or two before was a wasting asset by the late 1880s. In truth, Royalists sort of knew this, and they were forever urging their troops to try and imitate the more modern political organizations of their Republican enemies, but this was always a very tough sell. I mean, fairly typical was the reaction of a Royalist aristocrat and member of Parliament when told that he might want to think about creating a more systematic electoral organization. He responded in a fury. "My family's run this neck of the woods for decades. my daddy was a member of Parliament. My great-granddaddy was a member of Parliament. And now you're running around telling me that I should round up a bunch of local lawyers and veterinarians and shopkeepers, invite them into my chateau, and have them tell me how to run an electoral campaign? So needless to say, he did not, and I might add, he also lost the 1889 elections. Okay, but all of a sudden, the Royalists had this massive populist movement. A sexy leader, very unlike the dullest dishwasher pretender to the French throne. And all kinds of populist chaps in his wake, good at baby kissing, prepared to run modern, American-style campaigns, and who just happened to be 100% under the control of Royalists. Bingo. It's Biscuit City. Because there were still places in France where Royalists could get at most 40% of the vote. But if you ran some docile Boulangiste, he could get that 40% because the Royalists would dictate that that happen, and maybe pick up another notionally Republican vote because he seemed to be sort of Republican, and bang, you're over the top. You get enough of the guys those in Parliament, and maybe we can turn this thing into a monarchy after all. Well, okay, this did not work, but it was very clearly the calculations that these guys made. Now, so, obvious question, what does any of this have to do with fascism? Okay? It seems a bit of a stretch to call the Boulangiste fascist. But then Sternhell more or less did, so I was tempted to say that, you know, I really agree with Sternhell about the origins of French fascism going back to the time of Boulanger. Where I disagree is that he seems to think of Boulangism as left-wing, much like in his view was 20th century fascism. I, by contrast, have proven that Boulangism was essentially right-wing, much like, kindly see my now long-forgotten monograph, 20th century fascism. In fact, I effectively turned myself into a pretzel dealing with this fascism question. I actually penned the following sentence. Boulangism is not fascism, of course, but it incontestably adumbrates critical features of the later phenomenon. Let me plead with all you students out there, never, ever pen a sentence like this, because if you do, you will be, as was I, excoriated, and with good reason. Okay, well, the book on the Royalists eventually came out under the thoroughly misleading title, The Boulanger Affair Revisited, foisted on me by Oxford University Press in a desperate and unsuccessful effort to improve the sales figures. And the book actually got decent reviews, even in France, but it's still the case that even sympathetic reviewers tended to say, well, you know, what is a pretty good book would have been a whole lot better if Irvin could somehow, you know, stop trying to inflict on us his highly idiosyncratic views about fascism. Okay, so, you know, a second strikeout to all intents and purposes. So, by this time, it occurred to me that this oblique approach to the study of French fascism, you know, going by conservatives of one kind or another, was going nowhere. And so I would have to confront the issue straight on. This meant taking on the Croix de Feu, which was by far and away the largest political faction in the 1930s. And as even Raymond had admitted, crucial to the debate about French fascism. And several generations of French historians had categorically declared that to call the Croix de Feu fascist was not worthy of an historian and amounted to adopting the label-mongering antics of the interwar French left. Well, again, my skepticism always comes in here. and I wanted to always pose the question, this Olympian judgment is based on precisely what scholarly study of the Croix de Feu, which there, in fact, was none. Now, I set out to write it, but this book did not appear. And this is so because I had an epiphany. Well, two, actually. I'll get the other one later. Here's the story. I'm some considerable months into research on the Croix de Feu, and I'm out in what was then the newspaper annex out in Versailles, which holds all these, you know, local rags of one kind or another. I'm actually working my way through, I remember it now, it was the local newspaper, the weekly newspaper of the Croix de Feu in the Pyrénées-Orientales. And I'm assiduously making lists of, you know, the frequency of meetings, the number of sections in the movement, the number of people they seem to have. It's just, you know, important, but seriously tedious stuff. And I've done this now for several dozen departments, mobilizing all my evidence. And all of a sudden it hit me. This is what graduate students do. Now, hold it. Do not take this the wrong way, you graduate students or putative graduate students. It's just at this point, you know, I had a couple of books under my belt. I'm on the cusp of making full professor. And here I am, writing what appears to be a third doctoral dissertation. So it hit me. Why not save the many years needed to finish the book, the many more years needed to find a publisher, and instead pull all of my evidence together and make the case for the Croix de Feu as fascist in an article. So I did. I pulled every argument I could about the non-fascist quality of the Croix de Feu and attempted to debunk them, arguing that I alone had ever studied any of this. Well, this article was eventually published in the Journal of Modern History, and some people in this room know about it because Professor Churchill, for reasons best known to himself, inflicted it upon you this afternoon. Now, there's good news and bad, right? It's fair to say that no one in the last 20 years has written on the subject of French fascism, or even fascism in general, without making reference to this article. It is also, alas, the case that it is very often cited as an example of an ingenious but also tendentious and ultimately unconvincing argument. And it gets worse. You know, I wasn't going to do it, but I still thought that somebody should do a book on this important topic, and I foisted the topic off to one of my most gifted graduate students, Professor Sean Kennedy, currently the chair of history at the University of New Brunswick, who parlayed it into a great dissertation and a great book published a few years ago. Now, I'm always thrilled by and candidly prepared to bask in the reflected glory of my former graduate students. But I do feel constrained to observe that the thesis of my now very good friend, Sean Kennedy, is something like this. Old Irvin is often pretty good at what he does, but on the subject of the Croix de Feu and fascism, I'm afraid he's got his head seriously wedged. So what are you going to do? It's not for nothing that I am known as the Rodney Dangerfield of dissertation supervisors. But this did not matter. This did not matter because of my second epiphany. Sometime after the first, I sent my old friend and former dissertation supervisor, Arnaud Mayer, a draft of my article on the Croix de Feu. We met in a cafe in Paris, and, you know, as to the article, he said, yeah, it's pretty good stuff. But he also pointedly asked, Irvin, have you ever considered getting a life? Well, whatever did he mean? Well, what he wanted to know is if I really wanted to spend the rest of my academic career working on the right and fascism, a subject about which, as he pointedly reminded me, I was not making many converts. And he said, look, you know, Bill, you're a man of the civil libertarian left. Why not work on people you like rather than people you sort of despise? Well, I said, what did you have in mind? And he said, La Ligue des Droits de l'Homme, the League of the Rights of Man. Well, what was La Ligue des Droits de l'Homme? It was an organization which exists to this day, founded in 1898 at the time of the Dreyfus Affair, and founded to protest the obvious injustice directed towards Captain Dreyfus. It's roughly analogous to the American Civil Liberties Union, although it was far larger in proportional terms at the time than the ACLU and infinitely more politically influential. It quickly became the largest civil rights movement in the world. By the 1930s, it had 180,000 members, which is far more members than any political party in France, and probably more than all the political parties combined. About two-thirds of the left-wing members of Parliament belonged to the League. The League played a major role in the formation of the Popular Front, which is a rallying together of the parties of the left explicitly to stop fascism in France. They won the 1936 election, formed a government with Léon Blum, the much revered socialist leader, and in that government, 29 of the 34 cabinet ministers were also members of the Ligue des Droits de l'Homme, often very high-ranking members. And the League prided itself, with very good reason, for its vigorous action against fascism in France in the 1930s. So, perfect. These are my kind of guys. I don't got to worry about fascism anymore. All I got to do is admire the folks who stood up to them. So that's good. Only thing, I'm not too far into my research before I start picking up discordant notes. By way of example, in the early 1930s, I find a prominent member of the League saying the following: we must, albeit reluctantly, employ certain of the methods of fascism. He goes on to say that since French parliamentary democracy is a total piece of crap, it followed that, quote, the distinction between fascist states and democratic ones is merely a question of degree and not a fundamental one. Now, this is not some obscure moonbat scribbling in his notebooks. This was one of the most popular leaders of the League, and his remarks were made at the annual Congress of the League, and when he made them, he got a standing ovation. Now, some poor schmuck who happened to be a deputy in Parliament stood up and kind of, you know, scrubbed his head and said, gee, shucks, French democracy has got its problems, but it's surely not with its merits. It's surely not without its merits. And he was booed off the podium. Now, one sparrow does not make a spring, right? But suddenly I'm finding a whole lot of sparrows. One of those chirping away was a bright young man writing in the League's student newspaper. All that stands between a reconciliation between France and Nazi Germany, he opined, is the Jewish question. And, gee, he wondered, had German Jews ever given any thought to the reasons behind their, as he put it, eternal grievances? How about ethnic pride, he suggested, to say nothing of their sense of superiority? Jews, he went on to say, should be smart enough to understand that certain privileged occupations are not exclusively reserved for them. A few years later, we get a 30-year veteran of the League Central Committee who had just finished a visit to Nazi Germany, and mighty impressed he was too. Any French socialist, he said, would feel far more at home in Nazi Germany than he would have in the democratic Weimar Republic. And there was this constant issue of the Jews. Yeah, sure, he said, there are probably some good German Jews, but they are the victim, quote, the victims of the legitimate revolt of Germans against the bad Jews. At about the same time, another prominent leader saw fit to declare that Nazi Germany was a regime with a popular and principally working class base which instilled an egalitarian sentiment. As for the Jews, they were a social class against whom the people have mobilized. And it does not get much better when the French democracy collapses in 1940 and is replaced with the collaborationist regime. Interesting story. Just as Marechal Pétain is preparing to scupper the democratic regime, a former senior leader of the League, Gaston Bergerie in the event, drafts a manifesto, go by his name, the Manifeste Bergerie, which in some ways was the charter of the Vichy regime. As for the soon-to-be-destroyed Democratic Republic, good riddance, because it was a caricature of democracy and liberty. What France now needed was a regime that was social, national, and above all authoritarian, and prepared to engage with harmonious collaboration with Nazi Germany. Now, I could cite this kind of crap forever, okay? Suffice it to say that throughout the next 4 years, a significant number of former leaders of this league actively supported Vichy France, expressed open admiration for Nazi Germany, called for more collaboration with Nazi Germany, and blamed just about everything on the Jews. Well, this does kind of mess up my playbook. Now, I want to be clear. This kind of people I'm citing were always a minority within the League, but not so small. I mean, the gentleman I cited at the beginning, getting a standing ovation, carried 40% of the vote at that League Congress. But it was a minority. But it's a puzzle that anybody in, a civil rights organization could talk that way is simply mind-boggling. I have time only to make a couple of suggestions, but I think I can explain it one of two ways. The most sympathetic one would be, well, they're both sympathetic to people I'm not really sympathetic to, but one would be that these were hyper-democrats. They wanted a perfect democracy, wanting a pure one that exists in the real world. And, Third Republic France was frankly a kind of a messy outfit, like many democracies. And it was, always afflicted with assorted scandals. These guys were particularly outraged about a so-called Stavisky scandal, 1933-4, involving a low-class crook who made his way in the world by buying off assorted members of parliament and assorted cabinet ministers. The League's indignation did require a certain selective amnesia, because it turns out most of these people bought off were actually members of the League, but we'll let that pass. So, some of this was just, people wanting something pure and denouncing it when it doesn't reach an impossible standard. More fundamental was the question of pacifism. All these guys were integral pacifists. They'd been scarred by the senseless carnage of World War I, and they were thus of the opinion that no war, any time, any place, for any reason against any nation, including Nazi Germany, was justified. And so far, this is a legitimate extension of their defense of human rights. But by the 1930s, they were frustrated by the fact that more and more people on the left, many socialists and communists in particular, were coming around to the view that, well, at the end of the day, Hitler's got to be stopped. And their outrage goes some way to explaining their persistent anti-Semitic outbursts. Because the reason was something like this. Yeah, Dreyfus, yada, yada, a long time ago. I don't see why I should go to war because a handful of Jews are bent out of shape just because German Jews, largely their own fault, are getting roughed up. As for the argument that war is usually bad, but Hitler is something really different, and that changes things, they would respond by saying, well, you know, Hitler's not as bad as all that. There are some redeeming features to Nazism and so on and so forth. None of this explains their extraordinary conduct, but none of it justifies their extraordinary conduct, but it goes some way to explaining it. So, was this fascism? Well, at this stage of my life, I'm pretty gun-shy about calling anybody a fascist, but I do find myself remembering that the folks I once did call fascists, the Croix de Feu, were significantly more restrained in what they said about the Jews and virtually never found redeeming qualities in Nazi Germany. So what I can say is on a scale that has liberal democracy on one hand and fascism on the other, these minority within the Ligue de Droit de l'Homme were closer to the latter than the former. Anyway, these findings finally came out as a book. Took forever because I had to wait nearly a decade to get the League's archives to come back from Moscow. And it got mixed reception. In France, where the Ligue du Droit de l'Homme is what the French call a lieu de mémoire, reverential sites of memory, worthy only of hagiography, most commentators pretty much limited themselves to addressing the reasons why I should be publicly horsewhipped. Probably the best informed reviewer, for somebody who actually knows the League's history very well, asserted that just about everything about the book outraged him. In fact, reading it, I was mindful of Mary McCarthy writing about Lillian Hellman, some book by, or maybe the other way around, I can't remember. But in any event, saying just about every word of it is a lie, and this includes the and the and. I mean, there was the spirit of this. You know, he didn't want to end on a negative note, so he said, well, there was one good feature of the book. The index, he thought was pretty good. You know, I know this guy that I resisted, I was tempted to write him and say, you know, for the first time in my life, I didn't do my own index. So you didn't even have to pull your punches to that degree. Over here, reviews are better because North American scholars don't have so much invested. But there were even the very good reviewers, the charitable reviewers, said, once again, you know, Irvin's obsession with fascism leads to a certain imbalance. As one of them put it, you know, in the Vichy period, he's only got a few paragraphs on the significant number of League leaders who fought and sometimes died in the resistance, but endless pages on the Vichy collaborators. You know, I mean, why this imbalance? To which our reply would be, you know, there's a maxim in the world of journalism, which you all know in North America, right? Dog bites a man, it's not a story. Man bites a dog, it makes page one. And this is true in spite of the fact, but also because of the fact, that we've got a pretty good idea why a dog would bite a man. Not the faintest idea why a man would bite a dog, and it requires some kind of explanation. Well, ditto for these guys, right? I mean, that a bunch of people in a league founded to defend Dreyfus and civil liberties and the democratic regime should oppose Vichy, the antithesis of everything they stood for, is certainly to their eternal credit. But if you think about it, it's not very surprising either. That people from the same organization could openly defend all of the most odious aspects of Vichy is something that at minimum needs to be explained. Okay, you'll be pleased to know, to wind this thing down, I will not be coming up with a unified field theory about fascism in France or in general, which you would not in any case expect from a talk that at times seems to be an autobiographical review of my failures. Right? just 2 points. One, I do still think I was right about one thing. Whatever fascism might be, a critical ingredient for its success is the open complicity, or at least the benevolent neutrality, of critical conservatives' elite. They did not always care very much for their partners, but they could see their utility in preserving an imperiled social order. And the fact that they very often got rather more than they bargained for in their deal with the devil, the Italians probably, the Germans certainly, does not change anything. But also, I now must admit, I was for a very long time wrong about something else. For a good part of my career, I had always held that the left was left and the right was right, and the twain simply did not meet. And they simply didn't meet in particular in Sternhell's somewhat conceptually muddled ni droite ni gauche. Well, I was wrong. You know, my position has been it's either right or it's left, but it can't be both. But it can be. Just as there is an illiberal right, there is also an illiberal left. The latter mouthing all of the formulae, but forgetting, we're not ignorant of, the Enlightenment tradition that is supposed to inform anyone who thinks she or he is on the left. You know, examples abound, right? We can think of those people. Mussolini for Italy, Pierre Laval, or Marcel Déat for France, both incidentally members of the League. So maybe, wouldn't be his point, but Sternhell's title, ni droite ni gauche, wasn't so wide of the mark. In theory, there is no good reason why a principled conservative would ever consider consorting with the riffraff, be they fascist, proto-fascist, or just fascistoid. In theory, no member of a democratic civil libertarian organization could conceive of mouthing the kind of obscenities I have cited today. That's in theory. But in practice, they, right as well as left, often did, which does explain some of what went wrong in the first half of the last century. Thank you very much.